She caught me staring, smiled softly, and whispered, "You're blushing, that's cute." In that moment, I realized some attractions can't be ignored, even if they shouldn't exist. The first time I noticed her, it was one of those quiet, golden afternoons when the sunlight slips lazily through the cafe windows, painting everything in soft amber. I was sitting alone, my laptop open, but really, I wasn't working. I was watching the steam curl from my coffee cup and feeling vaguely out of place among the chatter and clinking mugs. And then she appeared. She moved through the space with a grace that made it seem like the room paused for a fraction of a second. Her hair fell just past her shoulders, catching the light in a way that made me blink, and there was a subtle perfume, something warm and slightly floral, that lingered in the air even after she walked by. I couldn't help but notice the gentle curve of her smile as she greeted the barista, soft laughter brushing against the hum of conversation. There was confidence in her movements, but it wasn't demanding or flashy. It was calm, deliberate, and somehow magnetic. Our eyes met for just a moment, and I felt that familiar flutter, that mix of curiosity and self-consciousness. I had no reason to look at her, no reason to linger, but I did. I found myself watching her hands as she reached for a book tucked under her arm, the way she flipped it open with a careful, almost reverent touch. And then, completely by accident, our fingers brushed as she handed the book to the cashier. A brief, electric moment, almost laughably small, yet it sent a strange warmth racing up my arm. I quickly pulled back, pretending to sip my coffee, aware of my sudden blush and the uneven beat of my heart. She noticed. I could tell, not by words, but by the tiny tilt of her head, the faint glimmer of amusement in her eyes. She didn't say anything, but her expression lingered just long enough to make me question why something so simple could feel so loaded. I tried to focus on my laptop, telling myself that I was imagining it, that I was overthinking. But I wasn't imagining the quiet pull I felt toward her, the way the air seemed to hum slightly whenever she moved nearby. When she finally turned away, I caught one last glimpse of her smile, directed at me, or maybe at the corner of the room where she thought I couldn't see. Either way, it was enough. Walking home that day, I replayed the moment in my head, the brush of fingers, the tilt of her smile, the warmth of sunlight on her hair. It was all subtle, nothing dramatic, but it left me feeling unsettled in the best way. Curious, nervous, and strangely hopeful. I didn't know her name. I didn't know anything about her. And yet I knew I wanted to. I wanted to find an excuse to be near her again, to hear her laugh, to notice the small details that made her feel alive. And maybe, in the quietest corners of my mind, I was already wondering if she might feel something too. It was, by all accounts, a simple encounter, but something about it felt like the beginning of everything. After that first brief encounter, I started noticing her more often, almost as if the universe had decided to place her in my path. It wasn't planned, she just appeared, again and again, in the same quiet bookstore or the corner cafe I frequented. At first, I told myself it was coincidence. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Our interactions were never long, and they were often awkward. My voice would catch when I tried to greet her, and I could feel my cheeks heating under the faintest of smiles she threw my way. She seemed to notice, too. There was a subtle playfulness in her eyes when we spoke, a slight tilt of the head, a quiet chuckle that made my pulse quicken even as I tried to act casual. She had this way of making me feel seen, without ever saying too much. I remember one afternoon clearly. I had been fumbling with a stack of books, trying to hide my nervousness, when she appeared beside me. "You always seem so serious," she said lightly, brushing her fingers against mine as she adjusted a book in the pile. The contact was fleeting, barely there, yet it sent a jolt through me. I stumbled over my words, mumbling something that sounded like nonsense, and she laughed, a soft, musical sound that made my stomach tighten. There was a rhythm to our encounters, a push and pull of closeness and hesitation. She would offer a gentle comment on something I said, and I would find myself leaning just a little closer, drawn in by the warmth in her tone. Sometimes she noticed the subtle signs of my embarrassment, a blush that I thought I'd hidden, a nervous glance, and she'd smile knowingly. "You're easy to read," she teased once, and my throat went dry. I wanted to respond with confidence, with a witty remark, but all I managed was a sheepish grin. Even in those small, fleeting moments, there was intimacy. A shared laugh over an offhand comment, the way she let a book linger in my hand, or the slight touch when she pointed something out on a page. It wasn't romantic in the overt sense, but it was charged with something unspoken, a magnetic pull that made it hard to look away. Walking away from each encounter, I found myself replaying everything in painstaking detail. How her hair caught the light when she turned, how her hand brushed mine, how her voice carried a warmth that lingered long after she left. I questioned myself constantly, was this just friendly banter? Or something more? Something forbidden, perhaps, given the quiet awareness of our age difference? Yet, despite the hesitation, there was a thrill in it. An undeniable connection that seemed to grow with every shared glance, every fleeting touch, every soft laugh. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to explain it. I just wanted to be near her, even if it meant navigating the nervous tension that came with it. By the end of that week, I realized something. I was no longer just noticing her. I was anticipating her. Looking forward to that brief spark of interaction that left me flustered, hopeful, and inexplicably alive. And I had the sneaking suspicion she was doing the same. After a few weeks of these quiet, magnetic encounters, something shifted. The teasing smiles and fleeting touches were no longer enough. There came a moment, a rare, still pause in the rhythm of our meetings, when the walls both of us carried began to crack, revealing fragments of vulnerability we hadn't yet shared. It happened in the little cafe by the river, late afternoon again, sunlight stretching across the polished wooden tables in long, golden fingers. I had taken my usual spot by the window, absently watching the rain begin to drizzle outside, when she appeared, carrying her usual calm confidence. She greeted me with that same warm smile, but there was a softness in her eyes that made me sit up a little straighter. Something was different. We began talking about something trivial at first, a new book she had read, the way the cafe smelled after rain, but the conversation gradually deepened. Without intending to, she started to share a memory from years ago, a story about a mistake that had embarrassed her at work, told with a mixture of self-deprecation and quiet grace. I listened, captivated, not just by the story but by the gentle honesty in her voice. It wasn't grand or dramatic, it was real, vulnerable, human. For the first time, I felt like she was letting me in. And I realized I could do the same. I told her a small, personal story, something embarrassing, something I usually kept to myself. I noticed how her eyes softened, the corners crinkling as she laughed lightly, not cruelly, but warmly, with that rare ability to make me feel accepted. Her hand brushed against mine as she handed me a napkin, and the fleeting contact sent a warmth spreading through my chest. It was intimate, but in the safest, most natural way. We fell into a rhythm of quiet sharing, the pauses between words carrying as much weight as the words themselves. I noticed details I hadn't before, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she laughed, the gentle way she rested her hand near mine on the table, the subtle rise and fall of her breathing as she spoke. Each detail made her feel more alive, more present, and made me feel more connected than I had imagined possible in such a short time. And yet, the vulnerability wasn't just about stories or laughter. It was in the small, unspoken things, the way we allowed comfortable silences to linger, the shared glances that said more than words could, the way our shoulders brushed when reaching for sugar packets. It was the unassuming intimacy of being close, emotionally and physically, without needing to define it, without forcing it into something it wasn't ready to be. By the time we parted that day, there was a quiet understanding between us. Something had shifted. What had begun as playful curiosity and nervous attraction was growing into something deeper, more honest. Something that made the occasional blush, the fleeting touch, and the lingering glances feel like the natural expression of a connection neither of us wanted to rush, but both of us were quietly longing for. As I walked home, replaying every laugh, every glance, every brush of skin, I realized that the most magnetic moments weren't the teasing or the awkwardness. They were these fragile, human ones, where vulnerability met understanding, and the heart quietly recognized the promise of something rare. By now, our encounters had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and thrilling. There was a quiet anticipation in seeing her, a flutter I could never quite control. And then, one afternoon, it happened, the first moment that made me realize the tension between us had begun to shift from playful curiosity to something quietly, unmistakably romantic. We were at the little park near the river, sitting on a bench beneath an old oak whose leaves whispered in the soft breeze. The sunlight slanted low, warming the wooden slats and dappled our surroundings in gold. I had been nervously explaining some mundane mishap at work, gesturing awkwardly, when I felt her gaze on me. I looked up, and she was smiling that same knowing smile, eyes sparkling in a way that made my stomach flutter. "You're blushing," she said softly, her voice teasing but gentle. "That's cute." My ears burned, and I quickly glanced away, fumbling with the strap of my bag. The words, so simple, carried a weight I hadn't expected. She wasn't just noticing me, she was seeing me. The way I reacted, the small, involuntary signs of my feelings. And instead of shying away, she leaned just slightly closer, the subtle warmth of her shoulder brushing mine, close enough that it made my pulse race without being overt. From that moment, the flirtation became a dance of small gestures and careful touches. She would brush a stray leaf from my sleeve, adjust my collar with the gentlest of fingers, or hand me a coffee with a lingering touch that I felt all the way up my arm. Every glance was charged with unspoken questions, every pause filled with the delicious tension of what might come next. I noticed the way her presence shifted the space around me. The park seemed quieter, the breeze warmer, the sun softer when she was near. Even a simple shared laugh carried a weight that made my chest tighten, a mixture of delight and something more electric, something dangerous in its subtlety. My words often stumbled, my thoughts scattered, but her calm, steady attention made it impossible not to be drawn in. What struck me most wasn't just the teasing, though that was intoxicating. It was the intimacy in the small, careful touches, her hand lingering near mine on the bench, the brief press of her fingers against mine when handing over a notebook, the way she would tilt her head just so, catching my gaze with a look that said more than words ever could. There was no rush, no need to define what was happening. It was enough to feel the pull, the silent acknowledgement that we were moving closer to something either of us could, or wanted to, ignore. Even in moments of silence, the flirtation persisted. Sitting side by side on the bench, shoulders nearly touching, I could feel her warmth, the subtle rhythm of her breathing, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the fresh air. My heart kept time with these small intimacies, and I realized that the quiet tension was no longer just an undercurrent, it was the main current, carrying us slowly, irresistibly toward each other. And as I watched her smile, softly teasing, lightly brushing against me in ways that made me acutely aware of every nerve ending, I understood something. The slow burn of attraction was no longer a subtle undercurrent. It was real, palpable, and entirely impossible to ignore. As the flirtation between us grew, so did the quiet storm of questions swirling in my mind. Each glance, each brush of her hand, and every teasing comment made my heart race, but they also made my thoughts tangled. Was it right for me to feel this way? Did the age difference matter so much to me, or was it only society's quiet judgment whispering at the edges of my mind? It was during a rainy evening walk that the conflict became undeniable. We were sharing a single umbrella, close enough that our shoulders brushed repeatedly, the scent of her hair mingling with the cool, wet air. I wanted to tell her so many things, how her smile lit up even the grayest day, how her presence made me feel seen, but I held back. Part of me feared rejection, the other part feared crossing some invisible boundary. She noticed my hesitation. I could see it in the tilt of her head, the softness in her gaze, and the way her fingers lingered near mine on the umbrella's handle. "You're quiet tonight," she said gently, and I forced a smile that barely disguised the turmoil inside me. The truth was, I was terrified of what these feelings meant, terrified of how vulnerable I felt, and terrified that acknowledging them could change everything between us. Back at home later, I replayed the day endlessly. Every brush of her hand, every laugh, every lingering look, it was intoxicating, and yet it made me question myself. Was I being reckless in letting myself be drawn to someone so confident, so assured, so undeniably herself? I was younger, less experienced, still figuring out life in ways she had already navigated. Could I ever be enough? Meanwhile, she carried her own quiet hesitations. Though she moved with calm confidence, there were moments when her gaze softened, and I could see her considering me, not just as a companion, but as someone who might fill spaces she didn't often let anyone enter. She too was aware of the social whispers, the unspoken judgments, and perhaps even her own surprise at how easily my presence unsettled her usual composure. Despite the uncertainty, there were moments that reminded me why this connection was worth the hesitation. A shared laugh over a private joke, a hand brushing mine as we reached for the same book, a quiet conversation over coffee where either of us pretended the world wasn't watching. All these small intimacies tethered my heart to hers in ways I couldn't ignore. It was a delicate balance, the thrill of closeness and the weight of reality coexisting in the same moment. Every step toward her was measured, cautious, and filled with both desire and doubt. And yet, in spite of all the questions and fears, I found myself drawn in irresistibly. I wanted to be near her, to explore the tension, to see if what we were feeling could survive the scrutiny of the world and the judgments we imposed on ourselves. By the time our walks ended and we parted for the night, there was no resolution, only the awareness that something profound was taking root, fragile yet undeniable. The emotional conflict lingered, like a quiet hum beneath the surface of everything we shared, promising both challenge and reward for the hearts brave enough to follow it. The moment of clarity came on a quiet evening, the kind of night that feels suspended in time. We had decided, almost instinctively, to meet at the small cafe that had become our unofficial refuge. The world outside had faded into soft rain and distant streetlights, leaving only the warm glow of the interior, the hum of low conversation, and the scent of coffee lingering in the air. For once, there were no distractions, no hurried steps, no awkward glances, just us. We sat across from each other, our hands resting on the wooden table, so close that I could feel the subtle warmth radiating from her skin. I watched her, taking in the familiar curve of her smile, the gentle movement of her fingers as she wrapped them around her cup, the way her eyes seemed to reflect the soft light. I realized then that I could no longer hide my feelings, not from her, and certainly not from myself. I need to tell you something, I began, voice low, tentative. She tilted her head, that same quiet curiosity in her gaze, and nodded ever so slightly. Encouragement. Permission. It was enough to steady my racing thoughts. I've been trying not to feel this way, I admitted, because I wasn't sure it was right. Or even possible. But I can't anymore. I like you? More than I probably should, but I can't help it. Her smile softened, and she reached out, brushing her fingers lightly against mine. The touch was electric yet comforting, grounding me in the present. I was wondering when you'd say it, she whispered, a faint laugh threading through her words. I wasn't sure if you would, but I felt it too. Time seemed to slow. The air between us vibrated with the quiet acknowledgement of feelings long simmering, feelings that had danced on the edges of words and touches for weeks. There was no need for dramatics or grand declarations. The honesty in that small moment was enough. I took a breath, leaning slightly closer, careful but intentional. Her hand stayed against mine, warm and steady, and I felt a sense of ease I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. The hesitations, the fears, the quiet social judgments, all of them fell away in that instant, leaving only a connection that was genuine and real. We talked then, softly, openly. About our fears, about the age difference that had hovered like an invisible wall, about the quiet ways we had been drawn to each other. Each word built trust, each glance reinforced intimacy. Even in our vulnerability, there was strength, a recognition that this wasn't a fleeting infatuation but something deeper, something worth exploring. By the time we stood to leave, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening in the lamplight. Our hands remained intertwined as we walked, the world around us muted, irrelevant. I realized then that the subtle touches, the lingering glances, the quiet blushes, every moment of hesitation, had led us here. And in that clarity, I felt something I hadn't expected, a warmth that wasn't just desire, but a steady, growing trust. The slow burn had finally reached its spark, and it was enough to fill the space between us with something both tender and undeniable. The morning after our quiet evening of confessions, the world felt different, as if the air carried a softer, warmer glow, just for us. I walked to the cafe, expecting the usual calm and sunlight filtering through the windows, but knowing now that everything had shifted. There was a lightness in my step, a flutter in my chest that made me smile even before I saw her. She was already there, seated by our favorite window, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. Her hair caught the early sunlight in soft waves, and when she looked up, her eyes met mine, holding that same gentle warmth that had drawn me to her from the beginning. The corner of her lips curved into a smile, one that felt like a quiet welcome, a reassurance that the moment between us yesterday had not been fleeting. As I approached, she gestured to the empty chair across from her, and I sat, careful not to rush the closeness we had begun to explore. Even seated, our hands found each other on the table, fingers interlacing naturally, easily. There was no need for words yet. The contact itself carried everything we were feeling: comfort, desire, trust. The conversation flowed effortlessly, light at first, playful, with small jokes and soft laughter. But beneath it all was an undercurrent of intimacy, a sense that we had crossed the threshold and could now simply exist together without fear or hesitation. At one point, she leaned forward slightly, brushing a strand of hair from my forehead, and the warmth of her touch lingered longer than it needed to. My chest tightened with quiet delight, and I caught myself smiling, flushed in a way I knew she noticed. We left the cafe together, walking side by side along the quiet streets. The city hummed softly around us, but all I noticed was the rhythm of her steps, the way our shoulders occasionally brushed, the subtle heat of her hand pressed against mine. It was ordinary and extraordinary all at once, the simplicity of shared presence infused with the intensity of our newfound connection. At a park bench, we paused, and I felt the easy silence that comes from true comfort. She rested her hand lightly on my arm, and I instinctively leaned closer, the warmth of her touch grounding me. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine what life might be like with her in it, not just these fleeting moments, but the quiet mornings, the shared laughs, the small intimacies that built a world entirely our own. Her smile met mine, soft and knowing. "You're blushing," she whispered, echoing the words that had begun this journey. But this time, it wasn't teasing, it was affectionate, warm, full of shared understanding. I laughed, brushing a hand against hers, and it felt like a promise, slow, steady, and entirely mutual. As we walked on, the sun rising higher, I realized that the story we had begun was not about rushing or conquering fear. It was about the quiet unfolding of connection, the gentle building of trust, and the simple joy of being seen. Our age difference, the subtle hesitations, the nervous blushes, they all felt like threads woven into the tapestry of what we were creating. And in that moment, I understood something profoundly simple: love doesn't always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes, it arrives in small touches, shared glances, and soft words that linger long after they're spoken. And as we strolled forward, side by side, I felt certain of one thing: this was just the beginning, but it was exactly where we were meant to be.